You go out in the cold and it's too cold, in which case the body will start shivering, and shivering is basically a mechanism to generate heat. Fever is basically body's way of trying to kill the pathogens, assuming that they are not going to survive in a hotter temperature. Literally everything in our body moves with the help of sodium-potassium ion exchange or sodium-potassium pump. Hey guys, my name is Jitendra Chouksey. I'm founder of Fitter, and today we are going to talk about cellular homeostasis and energy balance. Now, if you guys haven't watched my last episodes, I would request you to please go ahead and watch them, because if you don't understand the basics, then this chapter might be a little difficult for you guys to grasp. In the first episode, we discussed about how your body is made up of different kinds of organs. Organs are made up of tissues. Tissues are made up of cells. And in the last chapter, we actually saw what a cell is, what kind of cells are there, and how the cells function, right? We also saw how energy is produced from different kinds of fuel substrates in the body, right? So if all of that is clear, then we can move on to cellular homeostasis. But if you don't understand these basics, I would once again request you to go and watch the last two chapters, because otherwise it would be difficult for you to understand what I'm talking about here, okay? Cellular homeostasis is one of the most important concepts in biochemistry, physiology, because once you understand homeostasis, you will also understand a lot more about disease pathology. You will also understand why the body behaves the way it does. For example, why do you go out in the sun and suddenly you start sweating? Or when you are sitting inside the AC and the temperature is low, why do you start shivering? All of that will be covered and understood once you understand cellular homeostasis, right? So if you paid attention to the last chapter, you realize that cellular bodies, right, they seem like they are packed together, and there's trillions of cells, right? These cells, when they connect together, they make tissues, and these tissues make organs. But if you look at small tissue, and if you look at it under a microscopic lens, you realize that the cells are not actually packed together. In fact, there's a huge distance between cells. The cells are actually held in a state of suspended animation with the help of extracellular fluid matrix. So imagine a swimming pool and a person swimming in it, except it's not just one person. In fact, there is trillions of people swimming in the swimming pool. So that's exactly what happens inside the body. Your cells are not connected to each other. These cells are actually held together by extracellular fluid matrix. So just like how the cells have water inside them, there's water outside them, right? So intracellular fluid matrix, extracellular fluid matrix, and the cells are being held in this extracellular fluid matrix, right? So have a look at the diagram and you'd realize how these cells are spaced apart, but they are still connected with the extracellular matrix. Now, when we talk about cellular homeostasis, imagine a McDonald's franchisee, and there's a huge queue outside, and people are waiting for their breakfast. They're waiting for their burgers and fries and whatever, English breakfast. What will happen? The manager will come and they'll say, hey guys, there's a huge queue outside. Let's start working faster to clear the queue, right? And what will happen is, in case of a McDonald's franchise, the cooks and cleaners and the entire station, everybody will start working at a much higher efficiency to make sure that the external factors are minimized and the homeostasis within the McDonald's franchise is maintained. The stable environment inside the cell, you have to maintain it no matter the external factors, right? In a similar manner, the cell needs to maintain its internal stable environment no matter the external factors and the way the cell responds to it, right? So the ability to maintain the internal stable environment despite external factors is referred to as homeostasis. So cellular homeostasis is basically the ability to maintain a stable internal environment despite external factors. So what are some of the things that we are talking about when we talk about the stable internal environment inside a cell? We talk about cells pH. We talk about cells ion concentration. We talk about cells fluid, which is the intracellular fluid. And we talk about the cells temperature. So these four key components need to be talked about when we talk about cellular homeostasis. These four things need to be stabilized no matter the external factor. Once again, pH levels, ion concentration, temperature, and water balance. Now, how do these cells achieve cellular homeostasis? First of all, let's understand how do these cells actually get the raw materials they need, because in the last video, if you paid attention to, you'd see that these cells use raw materials, and then these raw materials are being used by ribosomes and lysosomes to produce protein and lipids in the ER, right? So how do these raw materials actually reach the cells? What about the oxygen? Because mitochondria requires oxygen to perform Krebs cycle. That's how we generate ATP. Paid attention? So how does the oxygen come inside the cell? So there must be some sort of a transport mechanism, right? There must be something that would allow a smooth transition of things going in and out of the cell. Without understanding this transport mechanism, we can't really understand or begin to understand cellular homeostasis. So let's also cover transport mechanism inside the cell, right? So think of a cell as an island, and let's say there's this guy who's relaxing on an island, but this island is like in the middle of the sea, much like the cell. And there's multiple islands, right? But this island has to perform certain tasks. Now, how can things reach this island? Okay, obviously somebody can come by a boat, someone can come by a ship, someone can just come directly by swimming, or the waves in the water itself can bring some raw material, plastic or something, right? Or somebody can land from a plane using a parachute, right? So these would be different kind of transport mechanisms. And think of this island as a demarcation, right? So there's the actual island, and then there's the part of the island which actually touches the sea. So in a similar manner, when we talk about a cell, so you have the cell, you have the nucleus, you have the mitochondria, ribosome, lysosomes, and then you have the cytoplasm, right? The intracellular fluid matrix. And all of this intracellular fluid is contained within the cell with the help of a cell membrane. And this membrane is what basically connects the cell to the extracellular fluid, right? So this membrane itself acts as a security gate. So remember we talked about how the cell membrane is actually a security gate in the last video, where think of you as an employee who's working in an IT company. You have a badge which allows you in and out of the building without any problems. But if somebody is a guest, he does not have the badge, the security will have to take them in and then take them out, right? That's also one way to go in and out of the building. Or somebody can just walk in, somebody can drive a car in, somebody can drive a scooter in. So in a similar manner, this membrane acts as one of the biggest control when we talk about transport mechanisms. So in a cell, there's different kinds of transport mechanisms, and we are going to basically talk about two of them. One is the active transport and one is the passive transport. Before we cover active transport, let's cover passive transport. The difference between active and passive is that active transport requires energy, requires ATP. Passive transport does not require ATP or energy. So first, let's talk about passive transport. In passive transport, we have three different kinds of transport mechanism. One is diffusion. Diffusion basically refers to when a substrate moves from a high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient. The best way to understand this is, let's say you fill up air in a balloon, and when you poke the needle, the air will keep coming out till the atmospheric pressure inside and outside the balloon are the same, right? So the air is flowing from high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient to match the atmospheric pressure, right? In a similar manner, let's say there's oxygen, and I told you that these cells are in a state of suspended animation. So how does the oxygen reach them? Well, the oxygen can pass right through the cellular membrane because this membrane is semi-permeable, which means that it can allow certain substances while block other substances. So in case of our bodies, the oxygen can cross through the cellular barrier and into the mitochondria, right? With the help of the process of diffusion. Diffusion basically means moving of a substrate from high concentration gradient to a low concentration gradient. So whenever there's oxygen outside the cell and the cells do not have sufficient amount of oxygen, the oxygen molecules will just pass through the cell membrane, and this process is referred to as diffusion. And there are certain other substrates which can pass through the cell membrane, but they require some sort of assistance. Like I was talking about the IT company, but you are a guest, you are not an employee, in which case the security guards will assist you. In case of cells, that's referred to as facilitated diffusion, in which case the substrate can go inside the cell, but it needs some sort of transport protein. A good example of this would be glucose. If you know glucose is basically one of the most important fuel substrates in the body. And every time your blood glucose levels go up, for example, your body tends to maintain a 70 to 110 mg per dl range blood glucose. Whenever you eat something, the blood glucose goes up and the body releases insulin. And what does insulin do? Insulin drives blood glucose inside the cells. So insulin acts as a carrier molecule, and then there are transporters which are inside the cell, and then they come to the surface, they collect the glucose and take them inside the cell. So these glucose transporters are an example of a passive diffusion, where you have the insulin binds to the insulin receptors on the surface of the cell, and then the glucose transporters come out of the cell and then collect the glucose and takes the glucose inside the cell, right? So this is an example of a passive diffusion. Another example would be osmosis. So this is best explained in the case of kidneys. A more relevant example would be how you would strain water, right? So when you have a tablecloth and you filter the water using a tablecloth, you'd realize that water itself passes. Impurities which are dissolvable in water would pass, but if there are solid particles which cannot pass through the tablecloth, they will remain on top, right? So this is an example of osmosis, where the water flows from one high concentration gradient to low concentration gradient, and it passes through a semi-permeable membrane, and therefore the water gets purified, right? So this is an example of osmosis. This is how your blood gets purified in the kidneys, right? I want to extend a bit on the glucose transporters or passive transport, because a lot of people have this confusion that whenever you consume something, let's say you consume carbohydrates and it leads to a temporary increase in your blood glucose levels, and insulin is released in response. We'll cover this in detail also, but let me just talk briefly about how it all works, right? So insulin will release, and then this insulin will bind to the surface of the cells, right? You have insulin receptors which will bind to the surface of the cell, and then it will open the cell itself. And then you have glucose transporters inside the cell which will come to the surface of the cell, will collect the glucose and take it inside the cell. Now, this is one of the ways in which glucose can be transported inside the cell. There's another way. So this was referred to as insulin-mediated GLUT4, and there are different kinds of transporters: GLUT1, GLUT2, GLUT3, GLUT4, 5, 6, and so on. But when we are talking about GLUT4 transporter, it is very important because GLUT4 is the transporter which is responsible for glucose absorption in your cardiac muscles, adipose tissues, and your skeletal tissues, right? So rest of the GLUT transporters, GLUT1, GLUT2, GLUT3, they are responsible for different organs like intestines, brains, and other places. But GLUT4 is the transporter which is responsible for absorbing glucose into your skeletal, adipose tissues, and cardiac tissues, right? So one of the ways in which the glucose is getting absorbed in the cell is via insulin-induced or insulin-mediated glucose 4 translocation. Whenever there's a rise in blood glucose level, there's going to be a rise in insulin levels, and this rise in insulin level is going to signal the GLUT4 transporters to actually come out of the cell like a lift. It will come out and then it will bind glucose and take it back inside. So this would be referred to as insulin-mediated GLUT4 translocation, right? Because the GLUT4 transporters are getting translocated from inside the cell to outside the cell, trapping the glucose and then taking it back inside. There's another way. So let's say you exercise. When you exercise, there's going to be a higher concentration of Ca ions or calcium ions or magnesium ions outside the cell. This also forces the skeletal muscle tissues to contract. And because of this contract, the GLUT4 transporters actually come on the surface of the cell, right? So this is referred to as exercise-induced GLUT4 translocation. So when a lot of people think, hey, insulin is needed to absorb glucose, yes, that is correct. For insulin-mediated GLUT4 translocation, exercise can also shuttle glucose in your skeletal tissues, right? And that's why when people work out, if you take their blood glucose at the time they're working out, you typically see that their blood glucose levels are higher, because your demand of glucose at the time, the higher the intensity, the higher demand. So if you are doing high intensity training, your blood glucose levels will be up. But immediately post-workout, because you are also experiencing a lot of exercise-induced GLUT4 translocation, the glucose will be shuttled inside the cell just because of exercise, right? So in case you were wondering if you really need insulin to shuttle glucose into adipose tissues or skeletal tissues, exercise can also do the same, right? And that's why we recommend people to do exercise, because exercise also improves your insulin sensitivity. One of the biggest contributor to insulin resistance is lack of physical activity and obesity, right? So I hope this is clear. Now, we have covered passive transport mechanism inside the cell. Now let's talk about active transport. So remember, I told you that active transport is where you require a certain amount of energy to move substrate in and out of the cell, right? When we talk about energy, we're referring to ATP, right? And we covered a bit about ATP in the last episode. So if you haven't seen it, please go ahead and watch it. So when we talk about active transport, one of the best examples of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump. Literally everything in our body moves with the help of sodium-potassium ion exchange or sodium-potassium pump. Whenever I have to do work, whenever I have to perform a certain task, let's say my brain needs me to move this arm and put it over there, okay? So what's happening? My brain is going to send a command and my nerves are going to fire up, and my nerves are connected to each and every muscle, forming a neuromuscular junction, right? So the impulses will basically fire up and they are connected to my actin myosin muscle fibers, right? So what will happen is there's going to be certain amount of energy which will be required, right? And each nerve is connected to each muscle fiber, right? So there's going to be certain amount of energy which will be required by moving my hand from here to here, okay? So what really happens is whenever there's electrical impulse and there's going to be exchange of energy, basically what happens is the ions in and out of the cell move. So when we talk about sodium-potassium ion exchange, basically there's concentration of sodium inside the cells and there's concentration of potassium outside the cell. And this knowledge is very important because it will be used extensively in the future to understand a lot more things about water balance in the body, right? So you have sodium ions inside the cell and you have potassium ions outside the cell. Whenever the nerve impulses are fired and ATP is required, the Na ions basically move inside the cell to outside the cell, and potassium ions actually come inside the cell. So refer to the diagram, you see that whenever there's energy, and basically you will have 3 sodium ions which will move outside the cell and 2 potassium ions which will come inside the cell. And what this does is it basically creates an electrochemical gradient. So just like in the case of battery, you have anode, cathode, you have high concentration gradient, you have low electrochemical gradient, and the current flows between the two. So in this case, what will happen is it will create a concentration gradient. So you'll have positive charge inside and outside the cell. So basically electrochemical potential. Because of the difference in electrochemical potential, the current will flow and this will cause the muscles to contract. And that's practically what's happening. So whenever I'm moving my arms from here to here, what's happening? My body is requiring certain amount of ATP. This ATP is going to facilitate the ion exchange, which means that potassium ions will come outside the cell to inside the cell. Sodium ions will go from inside the cell to outside the cell, creating an electrochemical gradient, allowing my muscles to contract. And that's how I'm moving my arm. Okay, so this is an example of active transport, in which case I would require ATP. If I do the same thing, if I do more exercise, if I move my muscles, I'm going to need more and more ATP. So this is an example of active transport. So basically we discussed briefly about homeostasis. We talked about how cellular membrane plays an important role in transporting materials in and out of the cell because they are not connected together and they are held in a suspended state of animation with the help of extracellular fluid matrix. Now, before we go further and talk about how homeostasis is maintained in the body, let's talk briefly about cellular energy, which we have covered in the last episode, but let's cover it briefly. So we know that ATP is the energy currency. And then we also talked about how glucose is one of the main substrates for producing ATP in the body. Glucose undergoes glycolysis, then it goes through acetyl-CoA cycle, then goes through ATP, where it generates a bulk of ATPs. So if this concept is clear, let's talk briefly about energy balance. Imagine a car. And a car is going to require a certain amount of energy, and typically it could be, let's say, a diesel car, it could be a petrol car, it could be an electric car. It doesn't matter what kind of car it is going to require a certain amount of energy, right? So you have a petrol tank, a diesel tank, or let's say an electrical battery, which is connected to your engine, and when the fuel is burnt, the engine moves and moves the car along with it, right? So in a similar manner, no matter whether you're a vegetarian, non-vegetarian, no matter what you eat, you are going to eat something, and that food is going to get converted in your body, and that's the energy which is going to drive you and your cells, right? So we know that ATP is the energy currency, but not energy itself. When we talk about energy, there's something called as calories, all right? So it's a unit of energy, like how we have joules, like how we have kilometers, like how we have meters. In a similar manner, a calorie is basically nothing but a unit of energy. 1 calorie is defined as energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius at 1 atm or 1 atmospheric pressure, right? This is referred to as 1 calorie. Every food that we consume provides a certain amount of energy. And you guys probably know this, that protein provides us 4 calories, carbs provide us 4 calories, and fats provide us 9 calories per gram of each substrate, right? Now, this is not exactly the number. These numbers are largely approximated using different kinds of methods because technically every food provides different energy, and also it differs from one individual to another individual. So the same amount of protein will provide me different amount of energy, and it will provide you different amount of energy depending on how well your body is able to metabolize protein, or depending on how my body is able to metabolize protein. But it's a good approximation. So 1 gram of fat, 9 calories, 1 gram of protein, and 1 gram of carbs, 4 calories each. So now let's get back to the car again. Now imagine this car is standing in neutral. It's on, but it's standing in neutral. It's not moving forward. The car is still going to require a certain amount of energy because the engine is running, the electrical systems are working, the AC inside the car is probably working, right? So what if it's not moving forward? It is still going to require some energy because a lot of things are running. In a similar manner, the human body, even though it's at rest, it's going to require a certain amount of energy because the heart is working, your brain is working, your liver, kidney, intestines, everything is functioning, right? So you're going to require a certain amount of energy. And this basic minimum amount of energy that you need to sustain bodily processes, even at a state of rest, is referred to as BMR or basal metabolic rate. You can easily go to Fitter app and go to tools section. You can calculate your BMR by entering your age, weight, height, detail. Again, it's an approximate measure. It's not a 100% accurate measure. It's an approximate measure, but it'll give you a good idea, right? And different people have different BMRs. Now, imagine that car started moving. It was in neutral, but now it's moving. Okay, so the car will go in first gear, second gear, third gear, so and so, and it will start consuming differential amount of energy, which will be slightly more. In a similar manner, if you are at rest, you are consuming energy which is equivalent to your BMR, but if you move around, if you let's say walk 10,000 steps, you are going to require additional 200 to 300 calories. If you start doing HIIT training, you are going to require certain more amount of energy, right? So at every stage, depending on how much more activity you perform, you are going to require more amount of energy for those activities, right? So that collective energy which you need for your body at rest and to perform activities will be referred to as total daily energy expenditure, right? And so one is your BMR, the second thing is your total daily energy expenditure. Now there are two more things that we need to understand here. One is your thermic effect of food. Every food substrate that we consume, whether you consume protein, whether you consume carbs, whether you consume fats, they at the end of the day needs to be broken down in the body. And for body to be able to break them down, the body is going to require a certain amount of energy. This energy is referred to as thermic effect of food, where the food itself demands energy from the body for it to be metabolized in the body, right? So the highest TEF is for protein. On a per calorie basis, proteins require roughly 20 to 30% of calories for their full digestion and absorption. Similarly, fibers and carbohydrate require somewhere between 15 to 20% of their total energy, right? So after protein, fiber and carbs have the highest TEF. Fats on a per calorie basis have the least amount of TEF, roughly less than 5%. So fats are very easily metabolized in the body. Fats are the easiest to digest and easiest to absorb in the body. So this is important to know because when a lot of people consume very less amount of protein, they primarily consume fat and carb-rich diet. They also don't get the benefit of higher TEF that they would have from intake of protein, which also reduces their energy expenditure. And the fourth thing is metabolic efficiency. Now, if you remember in the last episode, we discussed how one molecule of glucose can produce up to 36 to 38 ATPs and one molecule of fat can produce up to 138 ATPs. In ideal condition, this is possible, but in real world, this is not possible. In fact, individuals who are, let's say, metabolically obese, they actually produce far less amount of ATPs from the food that they consume, right? But healthy individuals, they tend to extract more ATPs from less amount of food, right? So there's the concept of metabolic efficiency. When you perform a higher amounts of physical activity, or let's say you're somebody who's well-maintained, healthier individual, you are going to extract far more number of ATPs, right? So metabolic efficiency, while it's a great thing to have, it's a good thing. It can improve your lifespan. It can also act as a double-edged sword in case of obese individuals. That's why when people go on crash diets, they improve their metabolic efficiency, but inadvertently they reduce their basal metabolic rate, because of which they can't lose weight even at lower calories. So there are four components of energy we discussed. First thing is your basal metabolic rate. Then we talked about total daily energy expenditure. Then we talked about the thermic effect of food, and the fourth part is metabolic efficiency. Now, all of these components are extremely important for you to understand how they help in maintaining energy homeostasis and cell. Now, energy homeostasis is maintained with the help of multiple things. Your endocrine system, remember last to last episode, we talked about how it acts as a traffic signal. Literally everything in the body is trying to achieve homeostasis, and your endocrine system acts as a regulator, right? So anytime you consume more food, and we'll talk about the glucose example in a while, but let me give you a superficial example of how you consume food and how you feel satiated, right? And how your hormones play a big role. Whenever you consume any kind of food, your intestine is going to produce different kinds of hormones. In case of, let's say, carbohydrates, fats, and protein, your intestine is going to release hormones like GLP-1, CCK, and PYY, right? And these hormones will indicate satiety. These hormones will actually tell you to stop eating, otherwise you'll just keep eating, right? So this is how food homeostasis is being maintained. You are consuming food and your body, in response to the food, is releasing hormones that's going to tell your brain, hey, stop eating, I'm full, right? In a similar manner, let's talk about glucose now. Let's say your body is maintaining a healthy blood glucose range of 70 to 110. You consume a candy bar, which is like 30-40 grams, right? Your blood glucose levels are going to shoot up, right? Blood glucose levels will shoot up, and as a result, your pancreas is going to release insulin. Now, the insulin is going to do what? It is going to bind to the insulin receptors on the surface of the cell, and it will drive down glucose with the help of GLUT4 transporters, right? But what if your blood glucose levels are actually low, which happens in case of fasting blood glucose in the morning? When you wake up, your blood glucose levels are low, right? In which case, your pancreas is going to release another hormone, which we call glucagon, and that's basically going to tell liver to start breaking down stored glucose or stored glycogen back to blood glucose. And that's how your body maintains fixed range. And it's not just in case of glucose. You see, in case of everything, your body maintains this range. And this is an example of a negative feedback loop. Let's talk about feedback loops. Basically, there's two different kind of feedback loops in the body. One is your negative feedback loop, which tries to get the system back to equilibrium, like we saw in case of glucose and insulin and glucagon. And there's a positive feedback loop, which actually tries to move the system away from equilibrium because it does not have a choice. For example, let's say you get a wound. The wound is going to be followed with accumulation of a lot of blood cells in the wounded area, thereby forming a blood clot. So the blood clot is going to get accumulated outside the body, right? So technically, I mean, it's still part of your body, but you get my point, right? It's not inside the body, it's outside the body. So it's moving the system away from equilibrium. So this is an example of a positive feedback loop. Another example of a positive feedback loop would be when you keep eating food, you actually develop a tummy, right? So a tummy is technically outside the body, right? So that's an example of a positive feedback loop where the changes actually move the system away from equilibrium, right? And then it creates a cascade of negative side effects. Right. So if there's excessive clotting keep on happening, and it will turn into something which is probably gangrenous or let's say, some sort of a tumor or something. Right. In a similar manner, if you do not have leptin, which basically is released by your adipose tissues, and if you don't develop a leptin resistance, you will just keep blowing up and eventually you'll die. Right. So there's a lot of things that get cascaded or that get triggered because of these positive and negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loop, like I said, the example of how the blood glucose concentration is maintained. Positive feedback loop, you're accumulating a fat, and another example would be blood clotting. These are examples of positive feedback loop. These feedback loops are primarily, like I said, controlled by different kinds of hormones, cytokines, enzymes. Pretty much everything in the body is trying to achieve homeostasis, and you achieve homeostasis with the help of positive and negative feedback loops. Negative feedback loops bring the body towards homeostasis, towards equilibrium. Positive feedback loops move the body away from equilibrium. Okay. Another example of this would be, like I told you before, right? So let's say you go out in the sun, and what's happening is when you're going out in the sun, it's tiring, it's exhausting, right? And let's say you're doing some sort of physical activity. When you're doing some sort of physical activity, there's going to be a lot of ATP which is going to be required, and your cells are going to break down, accumulate more damage. Your cells are working fast, and because of this, they are going to produce more energy, and more energy will result in more extracellular water, higher temperature inside the cell, right? So the cells will start dissipating the water as well as the temperature outside, so it will move to extracellular layer. The concentration of extracellular water will start rising. You'll also have heat which will start going up, and that's when it will activate the sweat glands, and the extracellular water along with electrolytes will come out, thereby again maintaining a stable cold temperature or a 37-36 degree temperature inside the body, right? This is an example of thermoregulation where a negative feedback loop triggers a cascade of reactions to maintain the cold temperature in your body. Another example of this would be, let's say you go out in the cold and it's too cold, in which case the body will start shivering, and shivering is basically a mechanism to generate heat, right? So again, try to maintain a stable temperature, right? So this is again a negative feedback loop. But let's say you cross a certain threshold where the body just cannot use a negative feedback loop to come back to a state of equilibrium, in which case, it will have like a positive feedback loop, and it will just keep making things worse. Like you can go in hypothermia or you can get dehydrated, right? So body will try to come back to equilibrium as much as it can, but over and above a certain threshold, it simply can't. So let's do a basic quick revision. What we've seen, we talked about cellular homeostasis. When we talk about cellular homeostasis, we are basically talking about pH, concentration, we are talking about iron concentration, we are talking about water concentration, and we are talking about temperature in and out of the cell, right? So these 4 components are basically what we talk about when we talk about cellular homeostasis. Then we talked about how the cells are not packed together, they are actually apart, and they are connected by the extracellular fluid matrix, and the transport happens with the help of cellular membrane. It's a semi-permeable membrane. It allows for passage of certain things while restricts some things, right? Some of the things like oxygen can pass through easily with the help of diffusion, which is high concentration gradient to low concentration gradient. But there are certain things that require help of external proteins, which is facilitated diffusion, as in case of glucose. Right? Then we talk about different kind of glucose transporters. We saw insulin-mediated glucose translocation. We saw exercise-mediated glucose translocation. We talked a little bit about how your body maintains a tight concentration of blood glucose with the help of insulin and glucagon. And this whole process is basically a negative feedback loop. Then we talked briefly about negative and positive feedback loops. We talked about thermoregulation. We talked about how the blood glucose concentration is maintained. Then we also talked about how positive and negative feedback loops are there. And positive feedback loop, an example would be blood clotting and gaining fat, right? So this is all about homeostasis. Once you understand homeostasis, you understand a lot of diseases are not really diseases. They are basically the body's way of trying to maintain a stable environment, trying to maintain equilibrium. For example, acidity. Acidity is basically body's way of telling you that, hey, please don't consume too much food. I'm not able to digest it. Or my stomach's pH is simply not going to support this, whatever you're doing in this lifestyle, right? And that's why you get acidity. In a similar manner, when you get fever, fever is basically body's way of trying to kill the pathogens, assuming that they are not going to survive in a hotter temperature, right? So body is always trying to go towards homeostasis. But like I said, when there are external factors involved, the body will move away from homeostasis using positive feedback loops, but it will try to maintain homeostasis as much as it can using the negative feedback loop. So I hope this chapter helped you understand how things work inside the body. In the next chapter, maybe we'll deep dive more into the endocrine system and how it helps in overall regulation of energy balance and in homeostasis, right? And simultaneously, like I've covered briefly about energy balance in this one, but once we understand the endocrine system, after endocrine system, we'll again revise energy balance. And you'd notice that I'm talking about the same concepts over and over again because I just want you to kind of revise these concepts as we go along. I'll keep talking the same thing, maybe repeat them over and over just so these concepts are getting hammered in your brain and you don't forget them. I hope you liked this episode, a little lengthy maybe, but it was an important one nonetheless. It's one of my favorite topics. I hope you'd enjoy this. Thank you so much. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.